Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Impending Crisis, America Before the Civil War, 1848 to 1861, by David M. Potter, completed and edited by Don E. Fehrenbacher, narrated by Eric Martin. Abbreviations used: AHA, American Historical Association; AHR, American Historical Review; AR, Alabama Review; CWH, Civil War History; IMH, Indiana Magazine of History; ISHS, Illinois State Historical Society; JAH, Journal of American History; JNH, Journal of Negro History; JSH, Journal of Southern History; KSHS, Kansas State Historical Society; LHQ, Louisiana Historical Quarterly; MHR, Missouri Historical Review; MVHA, Mississippi Valley Historical Association; MVHR, Mississippi Valley Historical Review; NHCR, North Carolina Historical Review; NEQ, New England Quarterly; NYH, New York History; PMHB, Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography; SAQ, South Atlantic Quarterly; SWHQ, Southwestern Historical Quarterly. Chapter 1. American Nationalism Achieves an Ominous Fulfillment. On Saturday evening, February 19, 1848, a little after dusk, a special courier arrived in Washington at the end of a remarkably rapid journey from Mexico City. He had left the Mexican capital scarcely 2 weeks earlier, had hastened through the mountains and down to Veracruz, where he took ship to Mobile, and from there had pushed on in only 4 days to Washington. His first act upon arriving was to deliver to Mrs. Nicholas P. Trist 2 letters from her husband in Mexico, after which he went on to the house of Secretary of State James Buchanan. To Buchanan he delivered a treaty which Trist had negotiated at Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd to terminate the war with Mexico. By this treaty, the United States was to acquire an area of more than 500,000 square miles, including what is now California, Nevada, and Utah, most of New Mexico and Arizona, and part of Wyoming and Colorado, next to the Louisiana Purchase, the largest single addition to the national domain. More than a century later, readers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and even Las Vegas might suppose that such a vast acquisition would have been hailed with wild enthusiasm, but this was by no means true. On the contrary, James K. Polk, a purposeful man then in the 3rd year of his presidency, found the treaty most unwelcome. True, its terms were closely in accord with what he had wanted when he sent Trist to Mexico in the preceding April, but since that time a great deal had happened. In September, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott had marched victorious into Mexico City. The occupation of the capital had brought Mexico to a crisis during which Santa Anna resigned as president, leaving the government 1 step away from collapse and the country itself ripe for acquisition. These events had stimulated some of the eagle-screaming expansionists in the United States to enlarge their aspirations and to join in a clamor which had been growing ever since 1846 for the annexation of the entire Mexican Republic. Even before these developments took place, Polk had prepared to raise the price of peace, and as he made plans for his annual message at the end of 1847, he drafted a statement threatening that, if Mexico protracted the war, more land cessions, in addition to California and the Southwest, must be required as further indemnity. His political caution later led him to fall back upon more ambiguous language, but by 1848 his original goals in California and the Southwest, which had once seemed so bold and aspiring, now began to appear parochial and unimaginative. At the same time, too, when victory was swelling Polk's ambitions, his emissary of peace had fallen into deep disfavor. Nicholas Trist, whose only previous distinctions had been his marriage to a granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson and his office as chief clerk in the State Department, had been selected to go to Mexico because he seemed a loyal Democrat who would do as he was told and would leave any of the potential glory to be harvested by Secretary Buchanan or other luminaries. But he had greatly disappointed Polk. First, he had indicated to the Mexicans a willingness to consider yielding the area in South Texas between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, which his instructions had given him no discretion to do. This alone determined Polk in October to hasten his recall, which had already been ordered simply because the president did not want to appear too anxious for peace. Then, in December, the president learned that Trist, after initially quarreling bitterly with Winfield Scott, had become a warm friend of the Whig general-in-chief, and that the two of them had planned to use Scott's war fund to buy a treaty from the Mexican peace commissioners. It was the bane of Polk's presidency that his best generals were Whigs, whom he hated more than Mexicans, and he had no intention of countenancing a Democratic peace commissioner who would collaborate with them. Polk, now thoroughly aroused by the reports of the use of bribery, had begun to plan the recall of Scott and was restlessly awaiting the return of his dismissed emissary. Then the incredible happened. On January 15th, a 65-page letter arrived from Trist, who had not received the message of October 25th recalling him until he was already deep in negotiations for a treaty. He knew the administration wanted a treaty. He thought it was within his power to achieve peace, and his moral duty not to waste this power. He believed that the letter recalling him was not binding because it was written without awareness of the circumstances in Mexico City. Thus the chief clerk, who had been appointed partly because of his expected pliancy, refused to be recalled and wrote on December 6th to inform the government that in his capacity as a private citizen he was continuing to negotiate a treaty of peace. The administration could use this treaty or not as it saw fit. For good measure, Trist lectured the president. He hinted that Polk planned a wrongful war of conquest. He implied that he and General Scott would save the administration in spite of itself. He denounced Polk's close friend Gideon Pillow as an intriguer of incomprehensible baseness of character. When Polk read this, his anger overflowed, and words of choking fury poured out on the pages of his diary. His dispatch is arrogant, impudent, and very insulting to his government, and even personally offensive to the president. It is manifest to me that he has become the tool of General Scott. I have never in my life felt so indignant. He is destitute of honor or principle, a very base man. Polk wrote these words on January 15th. Exactly 5 weeks later, Mr. Trist's treaty arrived on his doorstep. For 2 days, the president fought against the inevitable, but in fact he had no choice, and he knew it. For the Mexican War was highly unpopular throughout a large part of the country. It was regarded as a war of unjustified aggression on behalf of the evil institution of slavery, and Polk was denounced as a warmonger. The House of Representatives, under Whig control, had actually voted a resolution declaring its belief that the war had been unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun by the President of the United States. The public was yearning for peace, and the treaty was, after all, an exact fulfillment of Polk's own terms as formulated 10 months previously. He diagnosed his own predicament and stated it forcefully to his cabinet. If the treaty was now to be made, I should demand more territory, perhaps to make the Sierra Madre the line, yet it was doubtful whether this could be ever obtained by the consent of Mexico. I looked, too, to the consequences of its rejection. A majority of one branch of Congress is opposed to my administration. They have falsely charged that the war was brought on and is continued by me with a view to the conquest of Mexico, and if I were now to reject a treaty made upon my own terms, as authorized in April last, with the unanimous approbation of the Cabinet, the probability is that Congress would not grant either men or money to prosecute the war. Should this be the result, The army now in Mexico would be constantly wasting and diminishing in numbers, and I might at last be compelled to withdraw them, and thus lose the 2 provinces of New Mexico and Upper California, which were ceded to the U.S. by this treaty. Should the opponents of my administration succeed in carrying the next presidential election, the great probability is that the country would lose all the advantages secured by this treaty. There was nothing to do but to send Trist's document to the Senate. The Senate received the treaty on February 23rd, but did not immediately begin deliberations upon it, for John Quincy Adams had been stricken on the floor of the House on the 22nd, and congressional business was suspended until after his funeral. But then the Senate acted with remarkable promptness. Within less than 2 weeks, ratification was voted. But before the brief contest was over, events had demonstrated that complex and highly mixed attitudes lay behind the votes which saved the peace settlement. 2 especially significant amendments came to a roll call, and these 2 revealed the cross-currents in the Senate. On March 6th, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi moved an amendment which would change the boundary in such a way as to include much of what is now northern Mexico. Since Mexico could hardly be expected to accept this change, a vote for the amendment was virtually a vote to continue the war, but the amendment nevertheless received the votes of 11 Democrats, including Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, Daniel S. Dickinson of New York, Edward A. Hannigan of Indiana, William Allen of Ohio, and 7 slave state senators. On March 8th, George E. Badger, a North Carolina Whig, offered an amendment which would have deleted all territorial acquisitions from the treaty. Since it was a foregone conclusion that the treaty could never command a 2/3 majority in this form, the introduction of this measure placed Whigs who opposed both annexation and war in the dilemma that, to end the war, they would have to accept annexation, or to prevent annexation, they would have to prolong the war. Nevertheless, 15 Whigs voted for the Badger Amendment. 8 of them, including Daniel Webster, came from New England, 1 from New Jersey, 1 from Ohio, 3 from the border states of Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky, and 1 each from North Carolina and Georgia. From these 2 votes, it was evident that enough senators were dissatisfied with the treaty to defeat it. But when the decisive vote came on March 10th, the opposing groups could not combine. Expansionists who wanted to annex northern Mexico feared to reject a treaty which secured California and the Southwest, and on the question of ratification, only 5 of the 11 who had voted for the Davis Amendment now voted in the negative. If these 5 had been joined by the 15 Whigs who wanted no territorial acquisition, they would have formed a bloc larger than the 1/3 necessary to defeat the treaty. But the opponents of expansion feared to reject annexation, when this meant also to reject peace, and only 7 of the 15 who had voted for the Badger Amendment voted against ratification. On the question of ratification, 2 additional senators, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri and Sidney Breese of Illinois, voted in opposition. Altogether, 26 of the 58 senators had at various times voted against basic features of the treaty, but it was nevertheless ratified by a vote of 38 to 14. It was then hastily returned to Mexico, and there approved by both houses of the Congress, so that ratifications could be exchanged on May 30th. Thus, by the acts of a dismissed emissary, a disappointed president, and a divided Senate, the United States acquired California and the Southwest. This gigantic step in the growth of the American Republic was not taken with enthusiasm by either President or Congress, but resulted from the fact that the elements in opposition could find no viable alternative and no basis on which they could combine. It was an ironic triumph for manifest destiny, an ominous fulfillment for the impulses of American nationalism. It reflected a sinister dual quality in this nationalism, for at the same time when national forces, in the fullness of a very genuine vigor, were achieving an external triumph, the very triumph itself was subjecting their nationalism to internal stresses which, within 13 years, would bring the nation to a supreme crisis. Although serious potential divisions lay beneath the apparent unity of a triumphant nation in 1848, the fact remains that the appearances were indeed auspicious. Judging by material indications, no country on the planet had made such rapid strides in the fulfillment of national greatness and national unity as the United States at the midpoint of this century of nationalism in the Western world. Here was a country so young that many of the citizens were older than the Republic, yet in less than 60 years since the inauguration of George Washington, the population had almost doubled every 20 years, increasing from 4 million in 1790 to 23 million by 1850. The area of the country had increased from 890,000 to 2,997,000 square miles, and the march of empire, begun by 13 states strung precariously along the Atlantic seaboard, had not slowed its pace until the United States became a transcontinental, two-ocean colossus, with the superb endowment of natural resources that would enable it, in the 20th century, to assume a position of world leadership. Meanwhile, the original 13 had increased to 29 states, so that the majority of the states owed their existence to the creative act of the federal government. The strength of the infant Hercules seemed more impressive than ever before as Yankee volunteers patrolled the streets of Mexico City. In terms of government also, nationalism appeared to have made great strides. Andrew Jackson had shown that the president could be a national leader rather than a mere federal chairman of the board. A nationalistic Congress had adopted tariff laws to promote a nationally self-sufficient economy and internal improvement legislation to encourage a national system of transportation. In 1823, President Monroe had proclaimed for the United States a role in the Western Hemisphere which could be fulfilled only by a vigorous nation. Meanwhile, the federal courts were patiently laying the basis for a system of national law, a basis which John Marshall had proclaimed when he asserted, "The United States form for many, and for most important purposes, a single nation. In war we are one people. In making peace we are one people. In all commercial regulations we are one and the same people. America has chosen to be, in many respects and to many purposes, a nation." By modern standards, the political structure of mid-19th century America was still quite inadequate for a vigorous nation. Andrew Jackson had avoided extensive use of federal power, sagely observing that the strength of the nation depended upon the devotion with which its citizens supported it, and not upon the energy with which it performed governmental functions. He himself, by preventing recharter of the Bank of the United States, had effectively abandoned any effort to maintain a national monetary system. His party and the Whig Party were both coalitions of local organizations rather than fully developed national political organizations. But even if the political machinery did not bespeak a mature or complete nationality, there were nevertheless broad foundations of common experience and common culture on which American national unity was based. Students of the theory of nationalism generally agree that while nationalism itself is a subjective psychological phenomenon, a matter of sentiment, will, feeling, loyalty, and not an objective phenomenon capable of being measured by given ingredients, it is nevertheless true that a certain core of cultural conditions is conducive to the development of nationalism, and that among these conditions are common descent, language, territory, political entity, customs and tradition, and religion. Although no one of these components is indispensable, most of them are usually present in any fully developed nationality. By all of these measures, the American people in the 1840s showed a considerable degree of homogeneity and cohesion. The great immigration from Ireland and Germany began during the decade, but most of the population, save for the Negroes in the South, was of British origin, seasoned by long residence in America. Ethnically, America has probably never shown a greater degree of sameness than at the time when the nation was dividing and moving toward civil war. In 1850, more than 9 persons in 10 were of native birth, The total population was 23,191,000, and the foreign-born numbered 2,244,000. More than 1,420,000 had come to America in the decade 1840 to 1850, which, even allowing for mortality and reverse migration, still indicates that there were scarcely 1 million foreign-born in the United States in 1840, when the population was about 17 million. American speech, already distinct from that of England, provided just such a medium of nationwide communication as Noah Webster had striven for when he made it his object, through speller and dictionary, to promote a national language as a band of national union. Yankee twang and Southern drawl, to be sure, flavored the speech of diverse sections, but these were less serious as barriers to communication than the provincial dialects of Yorkshire and Somerset in England, or of Gascony and Alsace in France. The problem of a common territory had been a source of conscious concern to American patriots, who had at one time feared that the mountain barriers between the Atlantic seaboard and the Ohio Valley would mold the people of these areas into separate groups, or that the vastness of the Louisiana region would spread the population too thin for any real cohesion. But the development, first of turnpikes and steamboats, later of canals and railroads, had furnished a means to conquer distance and thus to neutralize its dispersive effect. Many Americans were acutely conscious of this fact. Thus it was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina who, in 1817, on the floor of the House of Representatives, warned that whatever impedes the intercourse of the extremes with the center of the Republic weakens the Union, and that not even dissimilarity of language tends more than distance to estrange man from man. Therefore, he exhorted his colleagues, let us then bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. By mid-century, the transportation system was still by no means perfect, but it had developed sufficiently to enable internal trade, which had been negligible at the time of the Revolution, to outstrip foreign trade by 1831, and to reach a volume 3 times as great as that of foreign trade by 1847. In fact, a regional division of labor had grown up, in which the South produced exports for the entire country. The Northwest supplied foodstuffs for the South and for growing urban and industrial centers in the East, and New England and the Middle States handled most of the commerce and manufacturing of the nation. These features of sectional differentiation involved friction at some levels, but they also led to economic interdependence, and they contributed to making the area of the Republic a common territory in a functional sense. It is remarkable that Calhoun and others, with their idea of strengthening the Union by improving communications, had arrived in an operative way at almost exactly the same functional approach to nationalism advanced at the conceptual level by Carl W. Deutsch. Deutsch argues that nationalism is best measured not in terms of common attributes, which present certain fallacies and circularities of argument, but in terms of actual volume and intensity of communications. A high incidence of communication bespeaks a complementarity and a tendency toward national unity among the people who are involved in it, and a lower incidence between these people and others indicates the limits of the national unit. Viewed in this functional sense, common language and common religion are significant because they enhance communication within the in-group and diminish the communication between the in-group and other groups. In religion, all sections of the United States responded to the fervor of evangelical Protestant Christianity and to the ethics of a gospel which, by promising damnation for sin and salvation for repentance and virtue, emphasized the responsibility of the individual. Hard work and self-denial were virtues, idleness and self-indulgence were vices, and this was no less true in the backwoods of Mississippi than in the most rock-bound strongholds of Yankee Puritanism, though lapses from grace might take more extravagant form and call for more emotional repentance in the backwoods. Enclaves of aristocratic Anglicanism and of intellectualized Unitarianism existed, but were minor, at least in numbers, while Catholicism still seemed exotic and suspect to most Americans. Protestantism was, in truth, a patriotic touchstone. The Bible figured as a sacred, patriotic symbol. In 1850, the census reported all church buildings and the numbers of people whom they could accommodate. The enumeration showed 37 Jewish churches, 1,227 Roman Catholic ones, and 36,534 Protestant ones. The Jewish churches were estimated to accommodate 19,000 people, the Catholic 676,000, the Protestant 14 million. It was recognized that the Catholics had greater numbers in proportion to their church accommodations, but even when heavily discounted, the figures are revealing and are more reliable than many church statistics. When, in the demoralizing hour of Lincoln's death, James A. Garfield affirmed that God reigns and the government at Washington lives, it was generally understood that the deity in question was a Protestant god, quite as certainly as the government was a democratic republic. The fact that it was a democratic republic was a further bond uniting the American people in a political communion. Travelers from abroad were forcibly reminded of the strength of the political ties which bound the citizens of the United States together, for the Americans boasted of them incessantly. After being asked how he liked our institutions, the traveler seldom had time to reply before his questioner would launch into a vainglorious harangue on the decadence of monarchies, the merits of a system in which the people were sovereign, and the superiority of republicanism, American style. So strong was the belief in American political values that it was hardly deemed excessive for Andrew Jackson in his farewell address to say that Americans were the guardians of freedom to preserve it for the human race, or for James K. Polk to call the Federal Union this most admirable and wisest system of well-regulated government among men ever devised by human minds. If common political ideals and loyalties bound the American people together, a common culture and a common tradition reinforced the political ties. Here was a body of more than 20 million people who had no privileged aristocracy, and, except for the Negroes, no proletariat and peasantry. True, the South had a tradition of planter leadership, and in New England deference was still due to ministers, magistrates, sea captains, and East India merchants. But in both areas, elite leadership had to be democratically exercised, as the Federalists discovered when Jefferson carried every state in New England except Connecticut in 1804, and as the Whig gentry of the plantation South learned when the hell-roaring Jacksonians swept them out of office and kept them out until they learned to match hard cider and log cabins against buckskin and plain hickory. Although urban working men were beginning to be a significant factor in the population, the vast majority of Americans still lived by the cultivation of the soil, and their lives were patterned by the rhythms and rigors of nature. In 1850, the population of the United States was 15% urban and 85% rural. The population of the North, the Free States plus Missouri, was 20% urban and 80% rural. That of the South, the slave states except Missouri, was 8% urban and 92% rural. California is not included here. Urban means living in towns of more than 2,500 population. Also in 1850, the number of free males gainfully employed was reported at 5,371,000, with 2,400,000 in agriculture and 944,000 in manufacturing establishments, which produced more than $500 per year output. The slave states' total of 1,569,000 included 957,000 in agriculture and 160,000 in such manufacturing. The Free States' total of 3,802,000 included 1,572,000 in agriculture and 784,000 in such manufacturing labor. In only 4 states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Jersey, did the numbers in manufacturing exceed those in agriculture. Pitting their muscle against the elements, these men were independent, aggressively individualistic, and fiercely hostile to external controls. Prizing the opportunity to become unequal in personal achievement.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?